Two young men broke into a neighbor's house in broad daylight. Strangely, they weren't there to steal anything, but to install surveillance cameras in every corner of the room. This way, every word and action of the neighbor would be completely visible to them, with no privacy at all. Afterwards, they tampered with the area under the back door, the ceiling light, and the glass of the master bedroom's rear window, and their reason for doing this was particularly bizarre. The two wanted to use the neighbor as the main character, creating various supernatural events at home, then record the neighbor's reactions to make a video, and post it on social media to gain traffic.
Everything that you will witness will be 100% real. The theory, simply put, with the proper execution, it is possible to drive an unsuspecting person into believing that they are truly being haunted.
For this purpose, they specifically chose a reclusive elderly person living alone as their experiment target, believing that his reaction to these strange events would surely make their video go viral. To achieve this, the equipment they installed was the most advanced on the market. This setup not only captures clear footage day and night, but also supports real-time wireless transmission, and even has anti-interference features to ensure stable operation without errors for the next month. Soon, the image of the elderly man living alone appeared on the screen. Seeing this, Ethan couldn't help but smile, and both of them began to feel smug, imagining the scene of becoming big internet celebrities. The next day, they heard from friends that the neighbor was reclusive and never interacted with others, even driving his own children out of the house. For more than 10 years, nearby residents have been saying that this old man is a wife-abusing, dog-killing pervert. However, these rumors not only didn't make them restrain themselves, but made the two even more excited. Soon they started the first experiment. Using the device installed on the light fixture in advance, they remotely cut off the power inside the house, and the neighbor was quickly awakened by strange noises, while the lights inside went out completely after a few seconds. The two of them stared intently at the surveillance screen, afraid of missing any detail, but the results surprised them a bit. The neighbor just walked into the room to check if the circuit breaker had tripped. At that moment, there was a sudden urgent knocking on the door from outside. To figure out the situation, they immediately turned the power back on remotely. The neighbor, full of doubt, walked to the door, and upon opening it, found out that the sudden power outage had triggered the burglar alarm. The patrol officer specifically came to check if he was in any danger, but he seemed completely unconcerned and even directly sent the concerned officer away.
而今晚唯一打扰我的就是呢。
After returning to the house to avoid being disturbed again, he simply removed the alarm. This scene left the two of them puzzled because they hadn't installed a listening device in that location, so they didn't know what had just happened and could only watch as the well-meaning officer left disappointed. The next day, Ethan noticed a visitor came to the neighbor's house, but strangely, the old man didn't want to open the door at all and even went up to lock the door, afraid the visitor would know he was inside. Seeing the door shut in her face, the visitor had no choice but to leave the documents at the door and turn away. As soon as the woman left, the old man immediately opened the door and picked up the documents from the ground. But the next moment, he tore the documents to shreds and threw them into the trash can. Seeing this, the two couldn't help but frown. After a while, they saw their neighbor accidentally knock over the trash can. At this moment, a kind neighbor walking their dog passed by and asked if he needed help. But unexpectedly, the neighbor started cursing at the man. It turned out that the man's dog always liked to urinate in front of his house, as if marking his territory, completely ignoring his presence. Then the old man fiercely warned the man.
Maybe I should teach him a lesson. Keep that son of a bitch on a leash, okay? Because the next time if it happens again, I'm going to cut him in 4 pieces and send him home in his can.
Let's go, boy. Let's go, boy.
After observing for several days, the two became increasingly interested in the neighbor's various strange behaviors, even more confident about the upcoming observations.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is part 2 of a segment that I like to call Knock Knock. You ready? All right, go. Ready and wakey wakey.
The dull thud of the door breaking the dead silence of the night instantly woke the neighbor. The two people in front of the screen were excited, as this bizarre scene was exactly what they were hoping for. In the surveillance footage, the neighbor, draped in a coat, walked unsteadily towards the back door with a blank expression. Strangely, he didn't seem frightened by the sudden noise, just indifferently pulled the inner door. The two held their breath, eagerly anticipating his next move. However, the next second, the neighbor walked out of the surveillance view. The two hurriedly switched cameras, searching for his whereabouts. At first, they were both very surprised. Could he really choose to ignore that eerie banging on the door? However, it wasn't long before the neighbor reappeared, clutching an axe tightly in his hand, and started hacking at the door frantically. Each axe blade fell with extreme violence and resentment. The piercing, chopping sound was especially terrifying at night, and he only stopped when the entire door was chopped to pieces. Both of them were completely shocked by this sudden scene. The neighbor in the surveillance looked extremely fierce, like a ruthless butcher. They thought this would be the end of it, but suddenly they noticed that the neighbor was staring directly at the surveillance camera. Could it be that the neighbor had known all along that they were the ones playing tricks? Ethan quickly grabbed the camera nearby, wanting to capture the moment, then zoomed in to confirm, discovering that the neighbor was just staring at the opposite wall. They were probably too nervous and mistakenly thought they had been discovered, but just as they said this, the neighbor disappeared from the surveillance with an axe. The two of them anxiously searched for his figure in the surveillance, but couldn't find any trace of him.
他在哪儿？医生，你确定他没看到我们吗？
Maybe he left.
The urgent knocking on the door outside disrupted their plan. Could that neighbor really have come? At this moment, Ethan quickly moved to the side, picked up a hockey stick, and prepared to battle the neighbor, not forgetting to remind Sean to record the whole process with the camera. But when Ethan opened the door, he found it completely silent outside, with no movement at all. Just like that, the two of them walked out the door one after the other. It turned out that it was Sean's father who had something to discuss with him, but couldn't reach him, so he came to take Sean away from Ethan's house. When Sean returned, he found that the neighbor had only placed the axe in the corner by the back door, and the neighbor himself was lying limp on the sofa. A few days later, Ethan noticed that ever since the eerie and strange banging noises came from the door that night, the neighbor had completely shut himself in, staying in the silent house every day and never stepping out again. He remained indifferent to the series of strange occurrences at home, as if he was unconcerned about all the abnormalities. This unusual reaction instead sparked an even more twisted excitement in Ethan for the upcoming observation. Soon, the two of them began the third experiment. At first, they thought it was because the previous door-banging experiment was too abrupt for him to handle, leading to such a frenzied overreaction, so they planned to prank the neighbor in a seemingly gentle yet more eerily creepy way. While the neighbor was still asleep, they remotely controlled the old stereo, making it suddenly play without warning, enough to scare the sleeping neighbor out of his wits in the middle of the night. Sure enough, the singing instantly woke the sleeping neighbor. The two stared intently at the surveillance footage, eagerly anticipating a panicked reaction from the neighbor. But to their surprise once again, the neighbor merely glanced at the room, then turned and walked back to the living room without any further reaction.
这很有趣。至少他没有用斧头看他。
It wasn't until the next day that Sean discovered an extremely eerie scene on the surveillance. The neighbor walked into the basement at 11:38 the previous night and didn't come out until 6:55 the next morning, meaning he stayed alone in the basement for a full 7 hours. But what exactly could keep him in there for so long? Could it be that he was frightened by the song that suddenly played, causing him to hide in the basement and not dare to come out? A few days later, the two prepared to complete the final paranormal event. They applied a chemical solvent on the window glass in advance, so that once the neighbor's bedroom heater was turned off, the room temperature would drop sharply, causing the glass to shatter. At 3 in the morning, the neighbor was awakened by the piercing sound of shattering glass. Then he suddenly got up and even wrapped himself in a blanket. Then he quickly walked to the hallway, only to find the thermostat's numbers rapidly dropping. He thought the device was malfunctioning and pressed it several times, but only 2 seconds passed. Upon hearing the noise, he immediately returned to the bedroom, only to see the window glass shattered all over the floor. Seeing this scene, the neighbor was neither startled nor panicked, but his actions became increasingly bizarre. He took off his coat, walked straight to the mirror, and kept combing his hair, as if the sight made his scalp tingle. Then, he took deep breaths and sat at the head of the bed. From a little after 3 in the morning, he sat until 5:14, then walked to the basement. However, when Ethan and Sean initially installed the cameras, they found that the basement door was locked, so they had no idea what he was doing inside. In the following days, the neighbor's condition worsened, and even during the day, he frequently went in and out of the basement. At night, he just sat in a chair, drinking continuously. At this point, both of them felt that the neighbor, just like the rumors said, was a psychologically twisted butcher, and there must be fragments of human lives hidden in his basement. The previous experiments happened to amplify his inner fears, which is why he frequently ran into the basement to hide. Before long, the two of them came up with a plan. First, install a listening device at the neighbor's door, then call the police at night to have officers search his basement so they could find out what was hidden there. They immediately split up to take action. Sean stayed in front of the camera, recording the footage and closely monitoring the neighbor's movements. But just then, the signal suddenly cut out for a few seconds, and when he looked back at the screen, the neighbor was already heading towards the door. Even more unfortunately, Ethan happened to knock over the outdoor watering can, and the noise immediately alerted the neighbor. Fortunately, the neighbor just went out to check and didn't become suspicious, otherwise their plan to become famous would have been ruined. In the evening, the two chose to call the police when the neighbor let his guard down.
Hi, yes, Ashland Police Department.
Soon, the police officers arrived at the scene. The two, using their previous identity as neighbors who yelled at the dog owner, falsely claimed to the police that they heard a woman's cries in his basement. After hearing this, the neighbor had no choice but to cooperate with the officers and let them search the basement. But to their surprise, the officers came out shortly after, having found nothing.
You gotta be kidding me.
He didn't find anything. He wasn't looking hard enough.
A few days later, Ethan's curiosity had grown to the point of near madness. He didn't want this observation experiment to end without results, so he discussed it with Sean. Since the officers didn't find any issues, why not sneak into the neighbor's basement themselves to investigate thoroughly? But as soon as this idea was proposed, it was firmly opposed by Sean. Ethan tried to persuade Sean, saying that although it was very risky, if their suspicion turned out to be true, their act of secretly filming the neighbor would not only avoid legal punishment, but could also make them famous. However, Sean remained unmoved and stuck to his opinion. In the end, the two had a big argument and parted on bad terms. A week passed like this, and the neighbor's kitten accidentally knocked over the hidden indoor surveillance. They immediately gathered in front of the screen, and the moment they saw this scene, their nerves instantly tensed up. And the surveillance camera lay on the ground covered with their fingerprints, which meant that the neighbor would immediately discover it the next morning, and their observation plan would be completely exposed, along with their dream of becoming internet celebrities. Upon hearing this, Ethan immediately had an idea. At this moment, the neighbor is still asleep. If we just sneak in quietly and take the camera, won't everything be fine? In the end, Sean couldn't persuade Ethan, so he had to let him go alone while he stayed at home to monitor the neighbor's movements and notify Ethan immediately if anything unexpected happened. Before long, Ethan successfully opened the door and immediately headed towards the camera. Unexpectedly, Ethan had secretly brought a handgun with him.
Oh God.
After a short while, Ethan also found the camera. On the other side, Sean was staring intently at the screen, afraid of any mistake. Originally thought they could smoothly retrieve the camera, but at this moment, Ethan suddenly discovered that the basement door was unlocked. Overcome with curiosity, he didn't hesitate at all and headed straight for the basement. Seeing this, Sean was anxious and helpless, so he switched the screen and focused intently on observing the neighbor's movements. On the other side, Ethan cautiously walked towards the basement, recording the entire scene with his portable video equipment. In the footage, a table was tightly covered with a stark white old cloth, as if hiding something unspeakable. After a moment of thought, he decided to pull back the cloth to see what was underneath. However, on the table, there were no terrifying remains as he had imagined, just densely packed medicine bottles, coldly gleaming syringes, and a twisted metal claw, exuding an indescribable eerie atmosphere in the dim light. Beside them stood a metal bell, conspicuously out of place in the deathly silent basement. Then, as if compelled by some unseen force, he reached out and picked it up. Unexpectedly, this action directly woke up the neighbor. Ethan was so frightened that he froze, nervously covering the white cloth back. At that moment, Sean sent a message. Not long after, Ethan rushed out of the basement, but he suddenly remembered that the basement door lock wasn't secure. He could only place the metal bell on the table for the moment, then quickly turned back to lock the door properly. But just at this moment, the neighbor had already walked out of the bedroom, and the two could run into each other at any time. Sean on this side of the screen was even more nervous than Ethan, who was in danger.
Hide, Ethan, hide!
Ethan, at his wit's end, hurriedly crawled under the living room table, tightly hiding behind the tablecloth. The next second, the neighbor walked out of the room expressionlessly and immediately looked towards the basement to confirm that the door lock was still intact, then turned to go elsewhere to get the basement key. Just as he turned back, he suddenly noticed out of the corner of his eye that the metal bell, which should have been in the basement, was now in the living room, and its position was exactly level with where Ethan was hiding under the table. If the neighbor just glanced down, there was a high chance of discovering Ethan. But eerily enough, the neighbor did not step forward to check, his face showing only a deathly indifference. Immediately, he turned around silently and walked towards the bedroom. On the other side, Sean hurriedly switched cameras, frantically searching for the neighbor's whereabouts, but the scene before him left him completely stunned. The neighbor was holding a handgun, walking with a vacant look towards the table where Ethan was hiding. If nothing unexpected happens, a life and death shootout is about to break out. Ethan tightly grips the gun, as if he is already prepared for mutual destruction. After a long silence, the neighbor seems to have made a chilling decision. But then, the most unexpected scene occurs. The neighbor suddenly points the gun at himself. The strong smell of water instantly filled the entire room, cold and pungent. After seeing the surveillance, Sean rushed madly to the neighbor's house. Witnessing the tragic scene firsthand, the two were completely frozen in place, their minds blank, with only deep-seated fear and confusion remaining. Until this moment, they suddenly realized that what they had done was no longer simple peeping, but had turned into a bloody murder they had caused, committing an irreparable serious crime. Even though it was the neighbor who pulled the trigger, they could not escape responsibility for this tragedy. Even if they were lucky enough to avoid execution, they were destined to spend time in prison. But now is not the time to collapse in panic. Only by cleaning up the scene thoroughly can there be a chance of survival. The two hastily agreed that Sean would be responsible for dismantling all the surveillance in each room and destroying all evidence. Ethan would quickly clean up the bloodstains on the floor before they solidified, and finally dispose of the body, ensuring that no one would notice anything unusual in the short term. But the next second, the police broke in and caught the two startled individuals red-handed.
Get on the ground now. Face on the floor, hands on your head.
Not long after, the officer in charge of the case formally charged the two. The police presented all the tools used in the crime and also revealed the truth behind the entire prank. It turns out that this so-called social observation experiment was planned by Ethan from the beginning to take revenge on his neighbor Harold. When Ethan was 13, his father, after drinking, committed domestic violence against his mother. Neighbor Harold found out and assisted Ethan's mother in calling the police, which led to his father's imprisonment and his parents' divorce. In Ethan's perception, he believed it was Harold who broke up his family, and he harbored resentment ever since, intent on revenge.
当我那天晚上回到家时，我注意到医生翻过了我的衣具。
And why did this concern you?
Because that's where I kept his father's gun.
Sean was skilled in surveillance setup and recording equipment, so Ethan encouraged the unsuspecting Sean to join in under the guise of a prank, to jointly carry out long-term harassment of Harold. After continuous observation, they discovered that Harold was an eccentric neighbor who reacted unusually to various pranks. This made them increasingly feel that he was peculiar. In the end, they even speculated that this silent neighbor might be a hidden psychopathic butcher, but the reality hit them hard. All the supernatural scenes they created were actually warm memories of Harold and his wife when she was alive. Harold chopping the creaky screen door with an axe was simply because it was a minor issue his wife used to complain about when she was alive.
Harold, this screen door won't stay closed. It keeps popping open.
And that sound system, which had been turned on for a long time, was playing his wife's favorite song. These subtle changes constantly evoked Harold's memories. The day they turned off the heating and let the windows freeze was precisely the day his wife Caroline was diagnosed with cancer. He set up a medical bed at home, preparing to accompany her through the last moments of her life. The metal bell that Ethan rang was the last gift Harold gave to Caroline, along with a promise that no matter what, he would come immediately when the bell rang. To him, the bell's sound was a call from his deceased wife. Harold ultimately took his own life, not out of fear, but to join his wife in the afterlife and fulfill their vow. When Ethan and Sean saw Harold frequently going in and out of the basement, they didn't realize it was just where Harold stored his wife's belongings after she passed away. Their continuous pranks made Harold mistakenly believe that his deceased wife wanted him to be by her side. After the two called the police and officers searched the place, he repeatedly asked the officers if anyone heard a woman's voice calling from his basement. In his heart, this was not an unusual noise at all, but his deceased wife calling him. After the officers left, he deliberately did not lock the basement door. He just wanted to personally listen to see if it was his wife's voice. In court, Carolyn's close friend Maggie also stood up to speak for Harold. She was Carolyn's most trusted friend. On her deathbed, Carolyn specifically asked Maggie to take good care of Harold. That day, Maggie was holding the nursing home spot she had spent 6 months applying for, just to ensure Harold received professional care. Everything she did was to fulfill her promise to her best friend. However, after Carolyn passed away, Harold became reclusive and withdrawn, voluntarily cutting off contact with Maggie.
Did he ever mention to you why he didn't want to receive proper care?
He never wanted to leave that house. 他说卡罗琳在哪儿？
请被告起立。
In the end, the two teenagers received severe legal punishment, but the lost life could never be recovered. They thought they were teasing a strange villain, but in the most cruel way, they repeatedly tore open the heart-wrenching pain of a lonely old man who lost his wife. The movie, The Good Neighbor, reveals a deeply hidden story of affection through the perspective of the observer. Many minors naively believe that age is a get-out-of-jail-free card, thinking they can exploit legal loopholes as long as they are not adults. But this ignorance and luck serve as a wake-up call, prompting the continuous improvement and refinement of the law. The most poignant part of this movie is that the person you see as strange may hide unknown kindness, and your casual malice might be the last straw that breaks someone.